I sacrificed my entire life for my only son, only to be thrown out like yesterday's trash to please his entitled expecting wife. I sat in an empty house, drowning in his agonizing silence, until a hidden laboratory envelope shattered her perfect little fairy tale and revealed a secret she thought she had buried forever. My son was completely sterile. But before that sweet moment of absolute justice, I had to survive the coldest betrayal a mother could ever face. My name is Yvonne. I am 62 years old, a retired high school principal living right here in Atlanta. I lost my husband when I was just a young woman, leaving me to raise our only child, Jamal, entirely on my own. I worked late nights, graded papers until my eyes burned, and stretched every single dollar just to make sure my boy grew up successful and strong. I gave him my youth so he could have a brilliant future, but that future apparently had no room for me. It was a freezing November evening when I stood on the porch of the beautiful home I had helped pay for holding a basket of homemade meals for my pregnant daughter-in-law, Chloe. The door opened, but Jamal did not invite me inside. He stood there, his large frame blocking the entrance with a look so icy it chilled me deeper than the winter wind. He looked me right in the eye and told me Chloe felt uncomfortable with my presence. My own son actually had the nerve to say that Chloe's upper-class white family was coming to town and that I was too loud, too much, and simply did not fit their vibe. He said they needed their own space to prepare for the new baby and explicitly told me not to show up to the baby shower next weekend. Before my mind could even process the absolute heartbreak in his words, my only child shut the heavy wooden door right in my face. I was left standing alone and shivering on the porch, staring at the closed door of a life I was no longer allowed to be a part of. I remember the years that led up to that freezing moment on the porch. My husband passed away when Jamal was just a little boy. I promised him on his deathbed that our son would never lack for anything, that he would have every opportunity in this world. And I kept that promise with my blood, sweat, and tears. I was a high school principal by day, managing hundreds of students, teachers, and endless administrative crises. But my day did not end when the school bell rang. At night, while Jamal slept safely in his bed, I sat at my kitchen table doing bookkeeping for small businesses around Atlanta until 2 or 3 in the morning. My eyes would burn and my back would ache, but I kept pushing because my boy had a brilliant mind. When Jamal was accepted into an Ivy League university, my heart swelled with an indescribable pride. But the tuition was staggering. I knew what student loans did to young black men in this country, how debt could chain them down before they even had a chance to fly. So I made a choice. I sold the vintage Mustang my husband had restored with his own 2 hands, the one thing he cherished most. I drained my retirement accounts, sacrificing my own golden years so Jamal could walk across that graduation stage with a clean slate. I wore the same winter coat for 10 years. I skipped vacations. I ate simple meals of rice and beans just to make sure his tuition checks cleared every single semester. I poured every ounce of my youth, my energy, and my finances into his future. I built the foundation of his success with my bare hands, believing that a mother's love and sacrifice would always be remembered and honored. I raised him to be a strong, educated, and respectful man. I thought I had done everything right. I gave him the world because he was my world. Every time I looked at his graduation photos, seeing him hold that degree with a bright smile, I felt every sleepless night was worth it. I believed we had a bond that nothing could ever break. I taught him the value of hard work, the importance of our heritage, and the absolute necessity of family loyalty. He was my pride and joy, the center of my entire universe. Jamal stepped into the corporate world as a financial analyst, making excellent money right out of the gate. That is when he met Chloe. Chloe came from a wealthy white family with a trust fund lifestyle and an appetite for things she never actually worked to earn. From the moment Jamal introduced us, she looked at me with a perfectly polished fake smile that never reached her eyes. She wore designer clothes, carried bags that cost more than my first car, and lived in a bubble of absolute privilege. When they got married, the complaints started almost immediately. Chloe constantly whined about their apartment. It was too small, the neighborhood was not exclusive enough, the kitchen did not have the right marble countertops. She made my son feel inadequate, despite his hard work. Seeing Jamal stressed and wanting to give them a solid start in their marriage, I made another massive sacrifice. I took the very last of my life savings, the absolute bottom of my nest egg, and handed over $100,000 for the down payment on a massive, luxurious mansion in a gated community. Chloe was thrilled, hugging me and calling me the best mother-in-law in the world, though her voice dripped with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. But I am not a foolish woman. 30 years as a school principal taught me how to read people, and my gut told me Chloe only saw dollar signs when she looked at my son and me. I loved Jamal, but I also knew I had to protect myself. Before transferring a single dime, I went to my personal attorney. I had him draft a rock-solid legal document classifying the $100,000 not as a wedding gift, but as a conditional loan. It legally bound them to specific repayment terms and gave me full authority to call in the debt or place a lien on the property if those terms were violated. I slipped the papers into a thick stack of closing documents. Jamal and Chloe signed everything without reading the fine print, entirely blinded by their greed and excitement over their new mansion. They thought they had secured a free ride, completely unaware that I held the ultimate key to their financial ruin. Once they moved into that mansion, Chloe's true colors bled through the pristine white paint of her perfect new walls. The microaggressions became a regular occurrence. She would make snide, passive-aggressive comments about the neighborhood I lived in, my traditional cooking, and my way of speaking. She treated me not like a mother, but like the hired help who had overstayed her welcome. It only got worse when her older brother Brad started coming around. Brad was an arrogant, lazy man who thought the world owed him a living just because of his last name and skin color. He practically lived at their house, eating their food, drinking their expensive wine, and joining his sister in talking down to me. Whenever I visited, Brad and Chloe would exchange mocking glances, making cruel jokes about my clothes or my culture right in front of my face. And Jamal did absolutely nothing. My brilliant, educated son shrank into a corner, constantly making excuses for his wife and brother-in-law. He would pull me aside and beg me to just let it go to keep the peace. He told me Chloe was just sensitive, and that I needed to adapt to her upscale lifestyle. My own flesh and blood chose to sideline his mother just to keep his spoiled wife happy. The final slap in the face happened a few months later. I was sitting in my living room scrolling through my phone when I saw a post on the internet. It was a picture of Chloe and Jamal holding a tiny pair of designer baby shoes with a caption announcing they were expecting a child. My heart shattered into a million pieces. My only son was going to be a father, and I had to find out from a social media post at the exact same time as strangers and casual acquaintances. They had not even bothered to pick up the phone and call me. It was a calculated, deliberate move by Chloe to show me exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of their lives. I was completely erased. The pain of seeing that digital announcement burned through my chest like hot coals. I had given that boy my entire life, and he allowed his wife to treat me like a distant, irrelevant stranger. I sat alone in my quiet house, tears of betrayal stinging my eyes, completely unaware that this unbearable disrespect was only the beginning of a much darker nightmare. The winter that followed was the coldest of my entire life. It was not just the chill in the Atlanta air that froze my bones. It was the absolute deafening silence from my own flesh and blood. Jamal completely cut me off. He stopped answering my phone calls. He stopped replying to my text messages. When Thanksgiving arrived, I cooked a full spread out of pure habit. I roasted a massive turkey, made my famous collard greens, and baked the sweet potato pie Jamal used to beg for when he was a little boy. I sat at my dining room table for 6 hours, staring at the front door, praying it would open. It never did. I ate entirely alone the heavy food, tasting like ash in my tired mouth. Christmas was even worse. I bought a beautiful wooden rocking horse for the baby and wrapped it in shiny gold paper with a large red bow. I drove all the way to their gated community, but the security guard at the front booth turned me away. He looked at me with deep pity and said, "Mr. Jamal left strict orders not to let anyone through without prior approval." I parked my car down the street and cried until I could not breathe. My own son was treating me like a trespassing criminal. I spent the holidays in an empty house surrounded by the haunting echoes of the past. I looked at the old photo albums. I saw the pictures of me working late into the night, the dark bags under my eyes, while little Jamal slept safely in his warm bed. I gave up everything for him. I gave up my youth, my peace of mind, and my financial security so he could stand tall. Now he was throwing me away like garbage just to serve a family of people who looked down on him. Chloe and her arrogant brother Brad did not love my son. They loved his substantial paycheck. They loved the massive mansion I had paid for. And Jamal was so desperate for their validation, so desperate to fit into their upper-class white world, that he was willing to sacrifice the mother who built him from the ground up. The agony of that realization physically hurt. It felt like a sharp knife twisting in my chest every single day. I lost weight. I could not sleep for more than a few hours. I spent my long days wandering from room to room, asking God where I went wrong. I wondered why a mother's devotion was so easily discarded for a woman's fake smile. I stayed in that dark place for months, drowning in my own tears, believing my life was practically over. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, and he was about to show me that my tears were entirely wasted on a massive, wicked lie. By the time spring arrived, I knew I had to pull myself together. I could not let the grief bury me alive in my own home. To keep my mind occupied, I decided to do a deep spring cleaning in my attic. I needed to clear out the clutter, maybe donate some old clothes and books to the local charity to feel useful again. I spent hours up there sneezing from the thick dust, moving heavy cardboard boxes, trying to sweat out the sorrow that was clinging to my soul. I pulled out a heavy plastic storage bin labeled with Jamal's childhood documents. I sat on the dusty floorboards and began sorting through his old report cards, his spelling bee awards, and his high school diplomas. Then my hand brushed against a thick sealed folder from Atlanta General Hospital. It was Jamal's medical file from when he was 15 years old. Seeing that faded logo brought back a rush of terrifying memories. Jamal had been playing in the state football championship. It was a vicious tackle, a horrifying pile-up on the field. I remember screaming from the bleachers as they carried my boy off on a stretcher. He suffered a severe crushing trauma to his pelvic region. We spent 3 agonizing weeks in that bleak hospital room. He required multiple reconstructive surgeries. I opened the file and stared at the final diagnostic report from his lead surgeon. The words jumped off the page, hitting me harder than a speeding freight train. The damage was extensive and completely irreversible. The doctor stated clearly and unequivocally that Jamal had a 0% chance of ever fathering a child. He was completely sterile. I remembered the day the doctor told us. Jamal was sitting in his hospital bed, his 15-year-old face buried in his hands, weeping uncontrollably about the future he had lost. I held him to my chest and promised him that God had a plan, that adoption was a beautiful path, and that his worth as a man was not tied to biology. He knew the truth. He had always known the truth. My hands began to shake violently as I held that medical report. If Jamal was completely sterile, how on earth was Chloe pregnant? The math was entirely impossible. A dark, sickening realization washed over me. Jamal must have wanted a child so desperately that he allowed himself to be completely brainwashed. Chloe must have manipulated him into believing this pregnancy was an absolute miracle from God. She knew exactly how to play him. She knew how to stroke his ego and feed his deepest, most painful desires. She handed him a shiny fairy tale, and my son was so blinded by his own trauma and his desperate need to build a perfect life with her that he ignored medical science. He chose to believe a beautiful lie over the concrete truth. But I am not a naive woman. I spent 30 years running a high school dealing with every kind of liar and manipulator under the sun. Miracles do happen, but not like this. Chloe was playing a dangerous, wicked game. She was pregnant, yes, but absolutely not by my son. She was carrying another man's child, and she was going to use that innocent baby to trap Jamal, to secure her lavish lifestyle, and to drain every single dime from the wealth we had built. My sadness instantly evaporated. The tears I had shed all winter dried up in a matter of seconds. I was no longer a heartbroken mother mourning a lost relationship. I was a fierce protector who had just uncovered a deadly threat to her family. Suspicion burned inside me like a raging wildfire. I could not eat a single bite of food. I could not sit still in my chair. I needed absolute proof of what my gut was screaming at me. I knew Jamal and Chloe worked long hours at their corporate offices on Tuesdays. I also knew I still had a spare key to their grand mansion. Chloe had been so busy kicking me out of her life that she completely forgot to demand the emergency key back. I told myself I was only going over there to do one simple thing. I took my great-grandmother's silver baby rattle from my wooden jewelry box. It was a precious family heirloom that had been passed down through 4 generations of strong black women in my family. I decided I would quietly go to the house, leave the rattle in the nursery, and walk away. It was my final gesture of love, a way to say goodbye to the child I thought might be my grandson, even if the medical records said otherwise. I drove to their upscale neighborhood, feeling my heart pound against my ribs with every passing mile. I parked my car a block away and walked to the massive front door. The spare key turned smoothly in the lock. I stepped inside the echoing house I had paid for. The air conditioning was freezing. The walls were painted a stark, clinical white. There was no warmth in this house, no soul, and certainly no love. It looked like a cold museum meant to impress wealthy strangers, not a home, meant to raise a joyful family. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase, my footsteps echoing loudly in the absolute silence. I made my way down the long hallway to the nursery. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense. There was a custom-imported crib, expensive velvet curtains, and a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. I walked over to the changing table, intending to place the silver rattle inside the top drawer and leave immediately. I did not want to snoop around. I did not want to invade their privacy. I just wanted to leave my blessing and walk out of their lives forever. But destiny had a completely different plan for me that morning. When I opened the top drawer of the changing table, it got stuck. I pulled a little harder, and the wooden track jerked abruptly. A heavy stack of expensive baby clothes shifted, and a thick white envelope slipped out from where it had been wedged flat beneath the decorative drawer liner. It fell to the hardwood floor with a soft thud. I bent down to pick it up, intending to shove it right back where it belonged. But the golden logo on the front of the envelope caught my eye. It was from an exclusive private genetics clinic downtown. The seal had been hastily torn open. My heart hammered wildly against my chest. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to look inside. I pulled out the thick stack of premium paper and began to read. It was a non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Chloe had run a secret DNA test while the baby was still in her womb. My eyes scanned the complex medical jargon until I reached the final conclusion page. The words were printed in bold black ink, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation. Probability of paternity for Jamal is 0%. I let out a sharp gasp, covering my mouth with my trembling hand. I was right. The medical records from his childhood were right. Jamal was not the father. But my eyes kept reading, and what I saw next made the blood freeze in my veins. There was a second profile, tested a secondary sample submitted for comparison. Probability of paternity is 99.9%. The matching DNA belonged to a man named Liam. I knew exactly who Liam was. He was Brad's arrogant, loud-mouthed white friend. The guy who was always over at the house, drinking my son's expensive liquor, lounging by the pool and throwing me dirty looks whenever I visited. He was a jobless freeloader who practically lived on their patio. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the baby was a bastard. She had slept with her brother's deadbeat friend in my son's house, gotten pregnant, and secretly ran this test to confirm the horrific truth. She was perfectly content to let my hard-working, educated son play the role of the loving provider. She was going to let Jamal break his back, drain his bank accounts, and alienate his own mother just to raise Liam's child. She was treating my son like a walking ATM machine. A wave of nausea hit me, followed immediately by a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. The kind of fury that only a mother who has watched her child be used and abused can feel. I did not scream. I did not break anything. I stood in the middle of that expensive, soulless nursery and let the anger burn away every last ounce of sadness I held for my son. Chloe thought she had won. She thought she had successfully discarded the old black woman who did not fit her elite country club aesthetic. She thought she could steal my money, steal my son's future, and build her perfect little fraudulent empire without facing a single consequence. I took out my phone and carefully photographed every single page of that laboratory report. I made sure the lighting was perfect. I made sure every name, every percentage, and every signature was crystal clear. Then I neatly folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it perfectly under the drawer liner, exactly as I had found it. I placed the silver rattle on top of the clothes, turned around, and walked out of that house. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was a storm about to make landfall. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase of that silent mansion and let the heavy front door click shut behind me. I walked down the manicured sidewalk to my parked car, my posture straight and my head held high. When I finally sat in the driver's seat, I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. A younger or weaker woman might have collapsed right there. A different mother might have screamed, banged on the windows, or sobbed until she lost her voice. But I did not shed a single tear. The betrayal I had just witnessed was far too deep for weeping. Crying is for a broken heart, and my heart was no longer broken. It was a block of solid ice. The heavy, agonizing grief that had weighed me down all winter evaporated completely, replaced by a razor-sharp and terrifying clarity. Everything made perfect, sickening sense now. I sat in the quiet of my car and mentally dismantled Chloe's entire operation piece by piece. She never loved my son. She never respected him. Chloe looked at Jamal and saw nothing but a walking ATM machine. She saw a highly educated, successful black man with a pristine credit score, a massive corporate salary, and an absolute desperation to be loved. Jamal was the perfect, respectable cover story for her dirty, shameful secret. Her brother's friend Liam was a jobless freeloader who could barely afford to pay his own cell phone bill, let alone fund the country club lifestyle Chloe felt entitled to. She knew Liam could never give her the designer bags, the luxury vacations, or the pristine image she craved. She needed a provider. She needed a host, and I had handed her the ultimate financial anchor on a silver platter. I thought about the $100,000 I had drained from my retirement savings. That money was supposed to be a foundation of love, a way to help my son build a secure future. Instead, Chloe used my life savings to buy $1 million nest for another man's baby. Once she secured the mansion, she had to get rid of the only person who could possibly see through her lies. Me. She pushed me out of their lives, convinced Jamal that I was too loud and too much, and completely alienated me because she knew a mother's eyes observe everything. She knew if I spent enough time in that house, I would eventually notice the strange looks between her and Liam. She needed me erased so she could play house without any interruptions. The sheer audacity of her wickedness made my blood boil. She watched my son weep over his medical diagnosis when he thought he was sterile. She watched him carry the heavy burden of believing he was broken. Then she miraculously presented him with a baby, convincing him it was a divine blessing, all while knowing she had slept with a freeloader under the very roof I paid for. She manipulated his deepest vulnerability to lock him down financially for the rest of his life. But Chloe made one fatal mistake. She underestimated the quiet strength of a woman who built her life from nothing. She thought I was just a tired old lady she could easily discard. She forgot that I spent 3 decades running a high school, dealing with every type of liar and manipulator in the city. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to my car engine roar to life. I was no longer a victim waiting in the dark for a phone call. I was a mother preparing for war. I drove away from that soulless mansion with a newfound clarity. I did not go home to cry or mourn the family I thought I had. Instead, I drove straight to the law offices of Sterling Davis. He had been my trusted attorney for over a decade. Every sacrifice I made, every dollar I saved, every night I stayed awake doing extra bookkeeping. It was all for a son who was completely willing to toss me aside, to raise the illegitimate child of a lazy freeloader. The sorrow was completely gone now. In its place was an absolute, unbreakable resolve. I walked into Sterling's office, sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his desk, and placed my phone on the table. I told him I needed to make some immediate and permanent changes. I opened my photo gallery and showed him the crystal clear images of the laboratory report I had found hidden in that pristine nursery. I watched Sterling's face as he read the words. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the undeniable proof of Chloe's deception. He knew exactly how much I had sacrificed for Jamal. Sterling looked up at me with deep sympathy, but I raised my hand to stop him before he could even offer a single word of comfort. I told him I did not come here for pity. I came here for justice. I told him it was time to activate the contingency plan we had put in place the day I handed over my life savings to fund their extravagant lifestyle. When Jamal and Chloe bought that massive mansion, Chloe paraded around, acting like it was all her doing. But the reality was that they could not afford the down payment. I gave them $100,000 to secure the property. However, knowing Chloe's reckless spending habits and entitled attitude, I had asked Sterling to draft a very specific legal agreement. The money was never a gift. It was a conditional loan recorded officially against the deed of the house. The contract clearly stipulated that they were required to make small annual interest payments to keep the loan in good standing. For 3 years, they had not paid me a single dime. I had let it slide out of a mother's love, wanting to give them grace as they built their new life. But grace is for people who appreciate it. I looked Sterling right in the eye and instructed him to call in the loan immediately. They were in default. I wanted a formal demand for the full $100,000, plus all accumulated interest delivered directly to their doorstep. if they could not pay it, and I knew for a fact their bank accounts were drained from Chloe's country club lifestyle. I wanted a lien placed on the mansion to force a foreclosure, but I was not finished. I asked Sterling to pull up my last will and testament. For my entire life, my primary goal was to build generational wealth for Jamal. Everything I owned was supposed to be his, not anymore. I sat in that office and systematically erased my only son from my legacy. I watched Sterling type up the revisions, deleting Jamal's name from every single asset I had spent 40 years building. It was a heavy moment, a moment that severed the final tie between a mother and her child. But I felt absolutely no guilt. He had made his choice when he shut that heavy front door in my face. I had to decide where my wealth would go. I thought about the young, brilliant black students at my old high school who possessed so much potential, but lacked the financial support to achieve their dreams. I instructed Sterling to establish a permanent educational trust. Every single dollar, every piece of property, and every investment I owned would be transferred into a scholarship fund specifically designed for hard-working African-American students from underprivileged neighborhoods in Atlanta. I wanted my legacy to build up young people who actually understood the value of sacrifice, gratitude, and hard work. When I finally signed the updated documents, a profound sense of liberation washed over me. I handed the pen back to Sterling and thanked him. I walked out of that law office with my head held high. Chloe thought she was so clever playing her wicked games in her pristine white mansion. They thought they held all the power. They had no idea that I had just pulled the financial rug right out from under their feet. The day of the baby shower arrived exactly 1 week later. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense for her grand celebration. She booked the most exclusive and expensive country club in the entire metropolitan area. It was a place dripping with old money pretentious crystal chandeliers and an overwhelming sea of her upper-class white relatives and elite friends. They were all sipping expensive champagne and laughing with that particular kind of arrogant entitlement that made my stomach churn. What none of those perfectly manicured guests knew was the absolute financial bloodbath happening behind the scenes. Every single drop of that imported champagne, every delicate floral arrangement, and every hour rented in that opulent ballroom was being charged directly to my son, Jamal's maxed-out credit cards. He was bleeding himself dry to fund a fairy tale that did not even belong to him. But I was no longer the exhausted, heartbroken woman weeping in a dark, empty house. I had shed that skin the moment I walked out of my lawyer's office. For the first time in over 40 years, I took a portion of my hard-earned savings and spent it entirely on myself. I walked into a high-end boutique and purchased a tailored, brilliant red suit. The color was bold, unapologetic, and fierce. It was the color of fire and power. I paired it with a pristine pair of black heels and styled my hair with absolute precision. When I looked in the mirror that morning, I did not see a discarded mother. I saw a queen preparing to reclaim her throne and burn down a kingdom of lies. I drove up to the country club, handed my keys to the valet with a confident nod, and walked toward the grand entrance. My posture was perfectly straight. My shoulders were pulled back, and my head was held high. In my hands, I carried a single, exquisite gift box. It was wrapped in rich, dark green velvet and tied with a flawless gold silk ribbon. It looked like the most precious and expensive gift a loving grandmother could possibly offer. Inside that beautiful box lay the absolute destruction of Chloe's entire world. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom, the lively chatter in the room instantly shifted. Heads began to turn, one by one. The clinking of crystal glasses slowed to a halt. The sea of pastel-colored dresses and tailored suits parted as I walked across the plush carpet. I stood out like a blazing inferno in the middle of a frozen tundra. My bright red suit demanded every single ounce of attention in that room. I could feel their judgmental, confused stares burning into me, but I did not shrink. I commanded the space. I scanned the room until my eyes locked onto the front table. There sat Jamal, looking exhausted and completely out of place in his own life. Beside him was Chloe, wearing a flowing white gown and a flower crown, looking like the picture of maternal perfection. Next to them, holding a glass of scotch and laughing obnoxiously, was Liam. The sheer audacity of having the real father sitting right there at the head table made my grip tighten on the velvet box. Chloe finally spotted me. Her fake, radiant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Jamal stood up, his jaw practically dropping to the floor. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I simply offered her a chilling, knowing smile and walked directly toward her table, ready to deliver my perfect gift. I walked straight toward the head table, with the measured, deliberate steps of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Brad was the first to react, jumping out of his seat with his face turning a blotchy red. He pointed a finger at me and yelled for the country club security to escort this woman off the premises immediately. Chloe clutched Jamal's arm, playing the terrified victim, begging him to make me leave before I ruined her special day. Two security guards in dark suits started walking briskly toward me from the back doors. I did not flinch. I did not retreat a single inch. I turned my gaze to the jazz band stage nearby, walked right up the two small steps, and calmly pulled the microphone from its stand. The microphone let out a sharp screech of feedback that echoed off the crystal chandeliers, instantly freezing the security guards in their tracks. I stood on that stage, looking out over the sea of wealthy, privileged faces. I held the heavy velvet box in my left hand and the microphone in my right. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my voice echoing through the massive room with a cold, terrifying authority. "I am Jamal's mother. I know my presence here is a surprise, but I simply could not miss the opportunity to celebrate this absolute miracle." I paused, letting the word hang heavily in the air. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. "You see, my son and his beautiful wife are experiencing something that defies all medical logic and human understanding. They are expecting a child, and as a grandmother, I felt it was my absolute duty to bring a gift that properly honors this incredible, unbelievable event." I stepped down from the stage and walked slowly to the head table. Chloe was shaking violently. Her manicured hands gripped the white tablecloth so hard her knuckles were completely white. Liam shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly looking very interested in his glass of scotch. Jamal stared at me, completely bewildered, caught between his wife's panic and my overwhelming calm. I placed the dark green velvet box directly in front of my son. "Open it, Jamal," I commanded gently, but with a tone that demanded absolute obedience. "Open your gift." Jamal reached out with trembling fingers. He pulled the gold silk ribbon, letting it fall to the table, and lifted the lid of the velvet box. Inside, resting on a bed of black satin, was a sleek silver picture frame. But it did not hold a baby ultrasound. It held the perfectly preserved medical diagnostic report from Atlanta General Hospital, clearly stating his irreversible sterility at age 15. Behind the frame lay a second document, the freshly printed, undeniable prenatal DNA test I had photographed and independently verified. Jamal pulled the papers out his eyes, scanning the bold black ink. He read the line stating his probability of paternity was 0%. Then his eyes dropped to the second line, the one naming Liam as the biological father, with 99.9% certainty. The color instantly drained from Jamal's face, leaving him looking exactly like a ghost. He dropped the papers onto the pristine white tablecloth for everyone at the head table to see. Chloe let out a horrified, strangled gasp. Brad choked on his drink, his arrogant sneer completely vanishing forever. The faces of Chloe's entire family turned ashen pale as the devastating, undeniable truth finally crashed down upon their perfect little kingdom of lies. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy, pressing down on the grand ballroom like a thick winter fog. Jamal stood there, trembling, as his eyes darted from the medical file confirming his sterility to the prenatal DNA test, proving the child belonged to Liam. The paper slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dying leaf. He dropped to his knees right there in front of the decorated head table, letting out a gut-wrenching sob that echoed through the massive room. It was the agonizing sound of a man whose entire universe had just violently shattered. Chloe's perfect, arrogant facade completely melted away. She was gasping for air, her face twisted in a pathetic mask of pure panic, desperately stammering out meaningless excuses that no one believed. The entire country club, packed with her elite friends and upper-class relatives, watched in absolute horror as her pristine reputation went up in flames. And then there was Liam. The arrogant freeloader tried to quietly slip out the back doors, but Brad grabbed him by the collar. The two men started shoving each other, knocking over a towering display of expensive crystal glasses that shattered loudly across the dance floor. It was a spectacular disaster. The elegant high society baby shower instantly degraded into a humiliating, chaotic circus. Guests were whispering loudly, pointing fingers, and grabbing their expensive purses to rush toward the exits. Chloe's wealthy mother was weeping into her hands out of sheer embarrassment, while her father stood frozen in absolute disgrace. I stood tall in my brilliant red suit, watching the magnificent collapse of a kingdom built on my stolen money and my son's broken heart. I did not smile, but a deep, satisfying peace settled firmly into my weary bones. The very next morning, before the sun even fully crested the Atlanta skyline, I put the second phase of my plan into relentless motion. My lawyer Sterling filed the official paperwork to execute the lien on their mansion. Because they had defaulted on the massive $100,000 conditional loan for years, I had the absolute legal right to seize the property immediately. Within 48 hours, the official eviction notices were served. Chloe, who had so proudly barred me from entering that gated community, was now being legally escorted out of it. She was forced out onto the curb with her designer bags and the child of a deadbeat growing in her belly. Liam, completely broke and terrified of financial responsibility, had already skipped town, leaving Chloe to face the devastating consequences of her wicked deception entirely alone. Her wealthy family, utterly humiliated by the public scandal and the sheer magnitude of her lies, completely cut her off to save their own fragile social standing. She lost the mansion, she lost her wealthy lifestyle, and she lost the devoted husband she had treated like a disposable bank account. She was left with absolutely nothing to her name. A few short days later, a gentle, hesitant knock echoed against my front door. It was Jamal. He looked completely hollowed out, carrying a single duffel bag, his eyes red and swollen from endless nights of crying. He collapsed onto my porch, burying his face in his hands, begging for my forgiveness. He sobbed that he had been so terribly foolish, that he was blinded by his desperate desire for a family, and that he finally realized I was the only person in the world who ever truly loved him unconditionally. My heart ached deeply for my boy, the precious son I had sacrificed everything to raise. I knelt down, wrapped my arms around his shaking shoulders, and kissed his forehead, just like I did when he was a little boy. I told him that my love for him was infinite, and that I forgave him completely. But when he reached for his bag to bring it inside, I placed my hand firmly over his. I told him he could not move back into my comfortable house. He had to learn to stand on his own 2 feet, face his own painful mistakes, and finally become the strong, independent man I always knew he could be. Blood, may determine who you are related to, but it is loyalty, honesty, and mutual respect that actually make a family. As women, as mothers, and as grandmothers, we are constantly taught to give every single ounce of ourselves to our children. We pour our youth, our energy, and our wealth into their futures, expecting nothing but a little love and dignity in return. But hear me clearly when I say this. You must never let anyone, not even the child you carried in your own womb, trample all over your self-respect. You do not stop being a human being just because you became a mother. Your sacrifices are a sacred gift, not an open invitation for someone else to exploit your kindness. We must always keep a safety net, a way out, and a strict boundary that absolutely no one is allowed to cross. You can love your family with all your heart, but never hand over the keys to your entire life, and your financial security to someone who does not value your worth. Let my journey be a warning and a fierce testament to the power of a woman who finally knows exactly who she is. Now, I want to hear from all of you listening out there. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have handled Jamal and Chloe the exact same way? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below and let me know which city you are watching this video from and what time it is right now where you are. I love reading your responses. Do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more fiery stories of women reclaiming their justice. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye, and until next time.